If you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to the channel. And if you're enjoying these stories, there's a link below to buy me a cup of coffee. This is the Chassidic Story Project with Barak Hullman, podcasting from Jerusalem, Israel. This podcast is sponsored by listeners just like you. To become a supporter of this podcast, please go to HasidicStory.com, HASIDIC story.com. You'll never know, you'll never know, you'll never know, you'll never know. Shalom Aleichem, my sweetest friends. It's another week, and we're getting closer and closer to Tishrei, to the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, and Shmini Atzeret. And so I have a story for you this week. Actually, I have 3 stories for you, 1 longer story and 2 short stories. But before I begin, I want to dedicate this podcast episode, as is my custom, to the continued success, Be'ezrat Hashem, of all of our soldiers in battle, wherever they are, the returning of all the hostages, whole, healthy, alive, Be'ezrat Hashem, the refuah shlema, the full recovery of everybody who's been injured or is ill, the comforting of those that lost loved ones, and the continued unity of the Jewish people here in the land of Israel and all around the world. One of the Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe, also known as the Baal Tanya, who was the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, was hired to be a Melamed, a Torah teacher, in a village. The Jews that lived in villages outside of the cities or the large towns were called Yeshuvnikim. Yeshuv is a Jewish village. The Nik is an association, so Yeshuvnik, Chabadnik, meaning somebody connected to that place or idea. And this Melamed stayed in the house of the Yeshuvnik and taught his children in exchange for food and a place to stay and a salary. And of course, he would teach other children in the Yeshuv as well, and he would send back the money to support his wife and children. Now, the Jews living in these distant places, away from large Jewish communities, did not have the opportunity to learn as much as somebody, for example, that lived in Lubavitch. There were multiple yeshivas, and there were many people to learn with and learn from. And so the Yeshuvniks were considered quite simple-minded and ignorant. It wasn't that they were lacking in faith. On the contrary, they were full of faith. They davened with passion, but didn't necessarily understand the davening or the reason for the mitzvot. And the Yeshuvnik that hired the Chassid of the Alter Rebbe was no different. He was a very simple person who had a farm and made money selling milk, animals, vegetables, eggs. And so when this Melamed came into town and offered his services, this Yeshuvnik was very excited to hire him. Little did he know that the Chassid was sent by the Alter Rebbe, who sent his Chassidim out all around to the rural areas where there were no cheders, where there was no Jewish school, in order to teach the Jews there. And so the arrangement was going very well. The Melamed was teaching the children were learning, the Yeshuvnik was working his farm, and then it came close to the time of Rosh Hashanah. And the Melamed asked the Yeshuvnik if he would be joining them for the Chagim, for the festivals. And the Melamed said, no, I've been working for you for many months now, and I've saved up money, and my plan is to spend the holidays with my wife and children, and also to be by my Rebbe, Rabbi Shner Zalman. Now the Yeshuvnik was disappointed because he told the Melamed, we were actually hoping that you would lead the davening here for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and you'd be the Baal Tokeah, the person blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. We were kind of counting on you. You see, the Jews from all the surrounding villages and hamlets, they all come together here to make a big minyan for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and we really need your help. And the Melamed said, I'm really sorry, but every year I go to my Rebbe for Rosh Hashanah, and this year is no exception. The Yeshuvnik says, your Rebbe? You, my friend, are a Rebbe, aren't you? Why do you have to go to a different Rebbe? And the Melamed tried to explain, there are Rebbes, and then there are Rebbes of Rebbes, to whom Rebbes like myself go to, especially on the Chagim, for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And we learn from our Rebbe, and our Rebbe helps us to grow and be better Jews all year round. And the Yeshuvnik really didn't understand this. So he says, but why do you have to go on Rosh Hashanah? That's when we need you the most. Why don't you go after the Chagim? And the Melamed said, you see, Rosh Hashanah is the head. Rosh means head, and it's the head of the whole year, and the head of all the festivals and all the days following the rest of the year. So the Melamed says to the Yeshuvnik, you know how important it is to have a good head on your shoulders, right? He says, yeah. He said, the brain is in the head, and the brain allows your eyes to see and the mouth to speak and eat and breathe. Everything depends on the head, right? A person couldn't live without their head, God forbid. And the Yeshuvnik says, yeah, okay. And the Melamed says, and the Rebbe is the head. What does Rebbe stand for? Rosh B'nai Yisrael, the head of the Jewish people. The Rebbe is connected to every Jew, but especially his Chassidim, and he's a great tzaddik. So we go to the head, to the Rebbe, to spend Rosh Hashanah, which is the head of the year. And we bring the head and the head together. And the Yeshuvnik is thinking, and he says to the Melamed, well, if what you're saying is that your Rebbe is the head, and Rosh Hashanah is the head, and you're going to be with those two heads for Rosh Hashanah, I think I'd like to come with you. And the Melamed was very happy to hear this. First of all, he couldn't afford a ride back to the Rebbe, and so he was planning on walking. But this Yeshuvnik had a horse and buggy, and so if he was going, he wouldn't have to walk. And so when the day came to head off to the Rebbe, the Yeshuvnik had his horse and buggy ready, plenty of food for both of them, and they went off in high spirits, singing Chassidic nigunim along the way. And when they arrived in the city where the Alter Rebbe was, they went to the Beit HaMidrash, to the house of study, and immediately the Melamed saw all of his friends that he had left behind, many Chassidim who themselves were off in faraway villages, teaching simple Jews. It was kind of an old-fashioned Kinnis HaShluchim, the gathering of the emissaries of the Rebbe, because all these Melamdim were essentially emissaries of the Rebbe. And so he was very happy to see his old friends, and they were happy to see him. And this Melamed in particular was known to be one of the big Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe. Now all the friends are patting each other on the back and hugging one another, but nobody looked at the Yeshuvnik. Every now and then they would realize he's standing there, they'd give him a handshake, but nobody embraced him and nobody even asked him who he was. And the Melamed told the Yeshuvnik, our custom when we come back to the Rebbe is to have a yechidus, a private one-on-one audience with the Rebbe. And so I've signed us up so that we'll have a meeting with the Rebbe. And the two of them stood in line, and the Melamed went in, and shortly after, he came out of the Rebbe's room, and the Yeshuvnik sees everybody going in and out of the Rebbe's room, so he figures, okay, I'm also going to go into the Rebbe's room. He walked into the room of Reb Shneir Zalman, and he was blown away by the Kedusha, by the holiness of the Rebbe, who was sitting behind a table with candles burning on the table. Taken aback and not knowing what the custom was in the Yechidus, the Yeshuvnik simply stood there and was quiet. The Rebbe was accustomed to people asking questions or asking for a bracha, a blessing, but the Yeshuvnik simply stood there and didn't say anything. So at some point the Rebbe said, "Nu," meaning, "What can I do for you?" And the Yeshuvnik was quiet. So the Rebbe said, "Nu," and the Yeshuvnik said, "Nu what? Rebbe, I don't understand. What do you want from me?" And then the Rebbe closed his eyes and started saying in a sing-song voice, the way that he often did when he gave over a mimer or a sicha. And the Alter Rebbe said, it sometimes happens that a Jew doesn't realize that the Yetzer Hara is tempting him. And instead of fighting back against the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, sometimes there's a Jew that doesn't know what they're supposed to do. And this Yeshuvnik is looking at the Rebbe thinking, what's he talking about? And then the Rebbe continued, it could be that a person ate bread and didn't wash beforehand and didn't bench afterwards. It could be that some mornings a person davens but doesn't put on tefillin because they're too busy trying to get to their farm work. It could be that sometimes a person is overpaid and instead of returning the extra money, keeps it for himself. The Alter Rebbe said these things, and the Yeshuvnik is listening, and he feels like the Rebbe was talking about the very things that the Yeshuvnik wanted to forget about, and certainly not be thinking about right now before Rosh Hashanah. And so he left the room of the Alter Rebbe, and being a simple Jew, and not knowing anything about tzaddikim and holy vision, he says to himself, I never met this Rebbe before. He never met me before. He knows nothing about me, but he seems to know everything about me. So clearly the Melamed, who had gone into the room before me, must have told the Rebbe about all the things he saw when he was teaching my children, while he was eating in my house and sleeping in my house, and I paid him a salary. How else could the Rebbe know all these things about me if it weren't for the Melamed telling him? And so when he came out of the Rebbe's room, the Yeshuvnik was so angry at the Melamed. He went over to him and he said, "How can you tell the Rebbe's lies about me? You should be ashamed of yourself, you snake. You tricked me. You brought me here and shared secrets with the Rebbe. You will never come back to my house again. You won't be a Rebbe for my children and not for me. I don't trust you anymore." Now the poor Melamed, he had no idea what was going on. And he said, "Chas v'shalom, God forbid. I would never do such a thing. I didn't even mention you to the Rebbe. Nothing." But the Yeshuvnik didn't believe him. And he said, "Not only do you tell lies about me, but then you deny it also. Get out of my face. I don't want to see you anymore." So the Melamed went to the Shamish, to the attendant of the Alter Rebbe, and he said, "I have to see the Rebbe again." He knocks on the Rebbe's door. He says, "The Melamed needs to see you." The Alter Rebbe says, "Come on in." And he says, "Do you know what happened when the Yeshuvnik left here? He thought that I told lies about him. He thought that I spoke Lashon Hara about him, that I slandered him, saying he did this thing and that thing. Rebbe, you know I was here in the room. I didn't say anything. And that's my livelihood. And on top of it, he's going to ruin my reputation." So the Alter Rebbe called in the Yeshuvnik, and the Melamed was there in the room. And he said, "The Melamed did not tell me anything about you. We didn't speak about you. There's no reason for you to be angry at the Melamed." So the Yeshuvnik said to the Rebbe, "But then how did you know about all of my transgressions? How did you know in detail things that I had done, that nobody could have known if it wasn't for the Melamed telling you?" The Alter Rebbe said, "Did I say that you did those things? I didn't say that you did those things. I said sometimes it can happen that a Jew is tempted by the Yetzer Hara, and he ends up doing, and I just listed things that came off the top of my head. But I didn't accuse you of doing any of those things." The Yeshuvnik said, "So nobody told you about me?" And the Rebbe said, "No." And then the Yeshuvnik said, "Rebbe, oh my God, I'm so sorry. All those things that you mentioned, I did them all, and much more. Rebbe, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." And the Yeshuvnik started to cry, and he asked the Rebbe, "What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to fix this?" And the Alter Rebbe said, "The first thing you're going to do is apologize to the Melamed for the anguish and the emotional suffering that you caused him, accusing him falsely, and you're going to rehire him so that people won't listen to the slander that you said about him. And then with each of the things that I listed, and all of the other things that you know yourself that you did, you're going to tell yourself, the next time you're going to behave properly, you're going to wash before you eat, you're going to bench afterwards, you're going to put on tefillin every day of the week, you're going to be honest in business, and everything else that you already know that you need to fix. And in the meantime, my friend, you're going to stay here for Rosh Hashanah. You hear the shofar being blown, and you'll be with my Chassidim for the davening, and that for sure will give you extra strength to overcome the Yetzer Hara and do the right thing." And so the Yeshuvnik had a Rosh Hashanah like he'd never had in his life. And when he went back home, he fixed all of the things that the Alter Rebbe had told him, and much more. And by the time he came back to the Alter Rebbe for Rosh Hashanah the next year, he was already one of the close Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe, growing in his Torah learning and his keeping mitzvot, and doing it with a fire of simcha, of joy, that only a Chassid of the Rebbe could achieve. So I have a couple more stories for you, short ones. The first one is told about Rabbi Yehuda Davis, who worked as a 5th grade teacher, teaching his students the basics of Gemara. And there was one boy in his class, whose name was Yossi, and Yossi had a difficult time understanding the lessons. No matter how hard he tried, he could not seem to grasp the Torah lessons given in school. And he was an optimist, Yossi. He came every day to school, hoping that that day he would get it, but he didn't. And many times he would leave school crying, feeling like a failure. And because he was having such a hard time in school, the other boys started making fun of him. And when they had a break during recess, they didn't want to play with him. They started calling him names, and all the teasing took its toll on this young boy. That confidence that he had and that optimism started to disappear. And as the year progressed, this happy, cheerful kid was now gutted and depressed. And Yossi's parents were, of course, very concerned. They took him to psychologists and all kinds of experts to see if they could find out why he was having so much trouble in school. They hired him private tutors, bought him special school supplies, offered him incentives, but nothing seemed to help. And Yossi's mother was feeling very heartbroken. Of course, as every parent knows, their children's joy is their joy, and their children's suffering is their suffering. And so Yossi's mother didn't know what to do. Her son wasn't able to learn. He was becoming more and more depressed. Nobody seemed to be able to help him. And then one day, something amazing happened. Yossi showed up to shul with a big smile, optimistic, full of good positive energy, and he participated in the class. He asked questions and could answer the teacher's questions. And during the recess, he asked the other boys if he could play with them. And they agreed, and he was having fun and laughing with the other kids. And his teacher, Rabbi Davis, was shocked. Nothing had changed. But all of a sudden, within one day, Yossi was thriving. And so, Rabbi Davis called Yossi's mother and said, "Can you please tell me what happened to make such a change in your son?" And she told the rabbi, "I was so worried about my son for months. I cried every day. I lost sleep. I imagined him suffering in school and people making fun of him, and I would hear him crying every night. His pillow was soaked with tears. And as his mother, I felt his pain so deeply. And then one day I had an idea. I told Yossi that we Jewish women have a very special time every week when we light the candles for Shabbos, when we bench licht." She told Yossi, "I always daven for you and all of my children when I light the candles for Shabbos. It's a special time, an Eit Ratzon, when I can pour out my heart to Hashem." She said, "Yossi, this Friday night, when I light the candles, you're going to stand next to me and daven with me, and we can both cry to Hashem, and maybe that will help you." She said Yossi was so desperate and miserable, he was willing to do anything. And so that Friday night, when Yossi's mother lit the candles, he stood next to her, and they both cried and whispered their davening to Hashem. And when they were finished, they looked at one another, and they felt that something had changed. Something had happened. And Yossi's mother said from that moment on, Yossi's confidence returned, and he was able to succeed in school. And the only explanation I have is our prayers and the tears at the time we lit the candles for the Holy Shabbos. You see, my sweetest friends, sometimes we don't know what to do. We're in situations where we don't know what to do, and so we daven. There's a story I heard on the news a long time ago, and it's interesting that 9/11 is around now. There was a senator or some big person in American politics who a reporter asked, "What are you doing about the attacks on the World Trade Towers?" And he said, "I'm praying." And she said to him, "That's very nice that you're praying, but what are you doing?" And he said to her, "Praying is doing." So my friends, praying is doing. And know that when you pray, Hashem is always listening. He doesn't always answer right away, but he's always listening. And so always daven to Hashem for whatever you need, for yourself and for others. And Be'ezrat Hashem, you should be answered quickly and in a positive way that you can feel the goodness. I have one more story for you about Reb Meir Raphaels. Now, Reb Meir was one of the Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe, and if you look at episodes 117 and 118, I have a two-part story called How Reb Meir Raphaels Became a Chassid. So Reb Meir, who was born around 1745 and was a leader in the community of Vilna, this was a time when the Misnagdim, the opposers to the Chassidim, were very strong. And there was a great deal of opposition to the Alter Rebbe. And then, of course, the story that I mentioned before, I tell in detail how Reb Meir became a chassid of the Alter Rebbe. But there are two additional stories that I came across. The first one is once Reb Meir was on a business trip, and he noticed that one of the strings on his tzitziot had ripped off. That meant that his talit katan was pasul, it wasn't kosher. And it's forbidden to wear a garment with four corners that doesn't have tzitziot on it. So immediately he took off the tzitziot, the talit katan. But he didn't want to go anywhere without having on kosher tzitziot. So he told his driver to stop. For several hours, they waited by the side of the road, hoping that somebody would come by with an extra set of strings for tzitziot so that he could retie them and continue on his way. And just as the sun was setting, they noticed somebody coming in the distance. And Reb Meir was calling out to the man, and he called louder and louder because the man didn't hear him until he was shouting. And then finally the man came towards him, and Reb Meir says, "Do you have any strings for tying tzitziot?" And the man said, "And if I did, do you think I'm going to go through my entire bag just to look for a few strings?" And Reb Meir said to him, "I'll give you all the money I have. It's over 1,000 rubles. It's worth a fortune. Please, I need the strings for the tzitziot." And so the guy says, "Sure, for 1,000 rubles, no problem." And he gets off of his wagon, goes through his trunk, finds the strings of the tzitziot, and hands them to Reb Meir in exchange for 1,000 rubles. Then Reb Meir, a couple weeks later, he goes to visit the Alter Rebbe. And when he entered the Alter Rebbe's shul, the Alter Rebbe stood up and handed him 1,000 rubles. But it wasn't just 1,000 rubles. It was the same 1,000 rubles that he had paid for the tzitziot. The same bills exactly. And Reb Meir says, "What's going on here?" And the Alter Rebbe said, "You should know, Reb Meir, that the person that stopped to give you the strings for the tzitziot, he wasn't a man of blood and flesh like you and I. He was Eliyahu Navi, Elijah the prophet, who had been sent down from heaven to test you. And I was given permission to give you back the money now that you passed the test of willing to give up so much money in order to do the mitzvah of tzitziot." The second story is that Reb Meir's home was always full of Chassidim who were coming to his house to talk about Chassidus and Farbrang. And there was a Chassidish minyan in his house. And any Chassid who came to Vilna knew that he would find a place in the home of Reb Meir. And Reb Meir, being a wealthy businessman, of course Reb Meir had a malamed in his house to teach his children. And the classroom and the shul that he had built next to his house had a very thin wall. And the malamed was not a Chassid. But every time he would hear the group discussing Chassidus, he would stop teaching the children and listen to the Chassidus. And Reb Meir would hear that the Malamed wasn't teaching, so he would go over and say, "Why did you stop teaching my children? I'm paying you to teach my children." And the Malamed, as hard as he tried, he could not resist listening to the Chassidus that was being spoken on the other side of the wall. And after a while, he came to Reb Meir. He said, "Please, Reb Meir, I beg you, let me join your group of Chassidim, because the ideas that you're talking about are literally mechaye nefashot, mamish, literally bringing back to life souls. And I want to be excited about Judaism like the Chassidim that are learning with you." And so I'm guessing Reb Meir had to hire another malamed, maybe build a thicker wall between the classroom and his house. But you, my friends, you get to hear Chassidic concepts all the time in these stories, again and again and again, even if you don't realize it. Just like Chassidus brings one back to life, so do the stories. This is a famous story of the Kotzker Rebbe, who was one of the famous Rebbes, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kotsk, who died in 1859. And he once said to his Chassidim, "Tchiyat HaMeitim, bringing back to life the dead, that's easy." He said, "I'll tell you what's hard. It's Tchiyat HaChaim, bringing those that are alive back to life." And so that's why we have the stories, my friends. And that's why we have the Chassidic concepts. And may we be blessed to grow in our learning of stories in Chassidus, and living them and telling them and sharing them. B'simcha tamid, always with joy.
Hi,
Thank you so much for listening, my sweetest friends, as always. I hope your preparations for Rosh Hashanah are coming along. Thank you to all the supporters of the podcast, all those that write to me and send in contributions, and to all the kids and the parents, and the Chassidim and the Misnagdim and everybody. Thank you for listening, my friends. Next week, I'll be back with some more stories, Bezrat Hashem. And of course, next week, being Chai Elul, which is the 18th of Elul, the birthday of the Alter Rebbe and the Baal Shem Tov, I'll have a story of the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe, Bezrat Hashem. Until then, my friends, have a beautiful Shabbos, a beautiful week. Take care of yourselves, and sei gesund.